Thank you, Rupin, and good day, everyone. It's great to be back and see so many friends that we haven't seen in person for several years, so this is a great event. I think, as most of you know, StatsCan has been rolling out the results of the 2021 census in a number of waves. There's 7 releases altogether. So far, we've seen 5, the most recent being yesterday when we got new data on the housing conditions in Canada and Canada's Indigenous population. So what I would like to do is to talk about the highlights that I saw in the first 5 releases, and in particular focus on the challenges and opportunities that the various trends present for governments, for businesses. I'm going to cover 7 different topics. One by one. We'll start with the big picture on national population growth. The census came in a little under 37 million Canadians, and you could see that the growth rate over the 5-year period since the last census was 5.2%. A little bit up from the previous census period, but much lower than where growth was headed before the pandemic. You can see in the insert on the top of the screen, year-over-year growth that actually reached a high of 1.4%, which would have been 7% or so over the 5 years before the pandemic hit and really pulled down the growth rate, getting us back to the 5.2%. And as we've known for many years, what's really driving the growth is immigration. The other component of growth, natural increase, you can see here on the screen in sort of the middle, has been gradually declining. The reason for that, we're an older population, we have more deaths, the difference between births and deaths is narrowing, heading down, and may in fact get close to, if not to 0, before too long. So we're left with immigration as the main driver of growth, now accounts for about 80% of growth. And I've broken out 2 components of immigration. One, the net permanent resident immigration, which we hear a lot about. The government sets targets for that every year that we'll come back to. But there's also temporary immigrants who come into Canada for various periods of time and are often overlooked. And I'd like to suggest that this is an important target group for many governments and businesses, and we'll touch on that in a minute. Why? You can see the numbers. Total permanent residents last year rebounded from the pandemic and was up a little over 400,000, a number we haven't really seen for many, many years. But look at the numbers of temporary residents. There were close to 900,000 people who were approved to come to Canada, many as international students, 600,000 students coming into Canada. A lucrative source of income for our colleges and universities, so they're very welcome, and also temporary workers. And they stay in Canada for various periods of time. But what's happening recently is not only do they stay in Canada for a period of time, but many of them start off as students, finish their studies, get a work permit to get Canadian experience for 2 or 3 years, and then convert to permanent residence. So, in fact, last year, about half of the permanent residents accepted into Canada had been here for a number of years and converted from a temporary status to a permanent status. So I think it's increasingly important to reach out to those temporary residents as well as the permanent residents that have been traditionally the focus. And you can see the targets the government has set for permanent residents this year, 431,000, increasing to 451,000, and the data I've seen so far shows that we're on track to hit that 430,000 this year. These numbers may in fact be revised. The government announces these targets every year, and sometime around November we'll get a good look. Okay. Not changing. There we go. Because of the importance of immigration in overall population growth, we've recently developed a new product, and Jan referenced this in her opening comments, the New to Canada product, which really tracks both permanent and temporary residents on a quarterly basis. and reports the countries of origin. We've taken the top 13 countries and for others broken them up into regions of the world. It's actually annual data that gets updated quarterly and sort of is a moving 12-month picture, and it's fairly timely. We're out about a quarter out of date. We have data so far for the first quarter of 2022. And you can see the importance of that. This just shows the sources of both permanent residents and the temporary residents, and you can see that last year, and in fact it's been the case for 3 or 4 years, about a third of all new immigrants into Canada come from India. Something very different than we looked at 5 or 10 years ago, when the Philippines used to be the #1 country, before that China. So it's changed in terms of the origins, and you can see other countries as well. And of course the data can be used to drill down, as Jan mentioned this morning, to a neighborhood level to look at where is the Indian migrants settling, where are the Chinese migrants settling, etc. So a very useful product. I don't know if I'm doing something wrong here or not. Okay, regional population growth. Been a change in the regional pattern of growth across the country. And what's happened is the large CMAs, the 6 largest CMAs with over 1 million population, have actually pulled back in terms of their growth rate a little bit, and other parts of the country, other CMAs, smaller urban areas, and even the rural parts of the country have increased their growth. That growth in rural areas is probably on the periphery of the large urban areas, not remote rural areas. You can see now about half of the country lives in one of the 6 CMAs, about 85% of the country lives in urban areas, and 15 or 16% in a rural area. And if we look behind the scenes in terms of what's caused this shift, there have been 4 different trends that's caused the shift in regional distribution of population. First, the substantial increase in international migration, particularly that temporary migrants that I referred to, and that's affected the 10 or 15 large urban areas. Then there was the downturn in the resource sector that had a real impact on Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland and Labrador. Then there was somewhat of a surprise to many, a turnaround in the maritime provinces. For many years, the maritime provinces had not really grown, had been declining in some periods, but they started to pick up growth in and around 2015. Part of that was related to the downturn in Alberta. Young maritimers could no longer move to the oil patch to work, stayed back home. But in addition, the Maritimes started to attract and retain immigrants. And they also, we saw, an outflow of people from Ontario back to the Maritimes. Perhaps people looking for opportunities there, perhaps some retiring back home, if you will. And then finally, a trend that we've been monitoring for many years, but that picked up steam during this recent period, is an outflow of people from the large metropolitan areas of Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. Those areas attract many immigrants, but balancing that to some extent is an outflow of people, no doubt, heavily determined by the cost, the availability of housing. And we'll have a look at that in a minute. So what's the overall picture look like in terms of growth? The Yukon was actually the fastest growing area of the country, followed, and you can see, by Prince Edward Island. Prince Edward Island attracts many immigrants compared to their small population, and that has really fueled growth. You can see PEI, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick all picking up that growth over the previous period. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, you can see Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland and Labrador all pulling back. The real impact of the resource industry. BC and Ontario still growing at a pretty good clip. I've updated the data from the census. We're a year past the census, and basically the picture is much the same. You can see the maritime provinces look like they're leading the way in terms of growth, as is BC, Ontario, Alberta starting to come back, and has a little bit above average in terms of these estimates. So where is the growth occurring if it's not in the big six? Here you can see the 10 census metropolitan areas that were the most rapidly growing. 4 out of the top 5 are in BC: Kelowna, Chilliwack, Nanaimo, and Kamloops. And you can see some in Southern Ontario, London, Kitchener, Guelph, all growing fairly rapidly, and 2 areas in the Maritime provinces, Halifax and Moncton. So a very different picture than we've been used to in earlier years when we would have seen Calgary and Edmonton, Toronto up there. The other area where we've seen a lot of growth are in the downtowns of our big cities. You can see extremely high growth in Halifax, Montreal, Calgary, and Toronto in the downtown areas. All of those condos that are around us here certainly fueling growth. Not all urban areas had growth in the downtown, a little bit of a decline in Quebec City as well as in Edmonton. I mentioned the outflow of people from the big 6 CMAs, and you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, this is the out-migration rate to other parts of the province from the 3 areas. And you can see how that picked up speed in the last area. No doubt, the squeeze on housing, we saw during the period immigration pick up, population growth pick up. If you look at housing starts, they were flat for the last decade. The gap between demand and supply widened and forced people to go further afield to find a home, to find an affordable home. Certainly those areas still grew. You can see on the right-hand side, a little bit below national average for Montreal and Toronto, a little bit above for Vancouver, but much lower than historically had been the case. So where did these folks go who left the big cities? And many of them went 2-3 hours away from Montreal, Toronto, or Vancouver. You can see in Ontario, Wasaga Beach, Tillsonburg, Collingwood, places growing fairly rapidly. In BC, places like Squamish, Salmon Arm, Vernon, some on the mainland, some on the island, growing quite rapidly. In Montreal, down in the eastern townships, up in the Laurentians, places starting to grow. And there were a number of other smaller areas, Canmore growing, outflow likely a lot from Calgary. A couple of interesting ones on that are 2 places in Manitoba, Steinbach and Winkler, that actually grew fairly rapidly, and their growth was due mostly to immigration. Because of the importance of migration and the shifts, a second product that we've recently developed, and again, Jan referenced this morning, was our new Mover Stats product that will become available in the coming months. And this tracks the number of people, the number of households moving in to a geographic area. It can be linked to PRISM to provide a profile of movers, and again, it's updated on a quarterly basis and is available down to a dissemination area level. And you can see here, this is just some test data that I just got out yesterday, actually, through the help of some colleagues, which shows the internal in-migration rate per 1,000 population in Q1 of 20, right in the middle of the pandemic, and Q1 of 2021. And you can see the big pickup in migration and mobility that happened during those periods. And I tied those back to PRISM to get, this is Calgary data, these are the 5 top segments of movers into Calgary in the first quarter of 2021. So this is an important new product that will allow us probably to improve our estimates, our demographics, as well as start to point to growth areas of the country. While we talk a lot about growth, and I focused on growth, important to remember that still large parts of the country, small towns, parts of rural Canada, are in population decline. And this map that maps the growth rate in so-called census divisions, counties here in Ontario, show the pinkish red areas are all areas which are in population decline. Some of them have been that way for many decades, and that certainly presents governments and businesses with challenges in terms of the sustainability of a business or the ability of governments to continue to provide services in a declining tax base. The next big trend, something not new, something we heard about, but again, it's picking up steam, is the aging of our population. And you can see here the age distribution of our population. Okay, thank you. This is the age distribution of our population as of the census. And this reflects the historical pattern mostly of fertility. You can see, for example, the high numbers of boomers now in their early 50s, reflecting the high fertility rates of the 1950s and early 1960s. Behind them, a smaller generation, Generation X. Behind them, the millennials, but equal in size to the Generation X, and a smaller Generation Z. Be a little bit careful, because in the next decade or so, the numbers in Generation Z and in the millennials will actually increase, because immigrants coming into Canada are focused mostly in those two generations. So those numbers will increase. Generation X will stay about the same size, and the boomers will start to decline as mortality takes its toll. And we can look at change over the 5-year period. No surprising, the highest growth is in the oldest population, growing by about 16%, about 3 times the rate of overall growth. But also notice the declines in population at some ages. The 45 to 54-year-old population declining by nearly 8%. And what that is that small Generation X that is behind the large boomer generation and pulls down the growth. Their children are in their late teens, early 20s, 15 to 24, and you can see a bit of a decline there as well, something that contributes to the labor shortages we hear, particularly in retail and other areas which hire young people, not as many as there used to be. And there was actually a decline in the number of toddlers in the country, fertility pulled back in recent years. And the aging and particularly the changes in the age distribution present us with a number of challenges and opportunities, and I'd just like to mention 3 of them. The first is the growth of the seniors population. You can see over the last 20 years, 80% increase in the seniors population compared to 13% in the under 65. What's ahead? More of that, not quite as rapid a growth, but still a 50% increase in the seniors population over the age of 65. But there's a change in that the growth in the over 65 population is now shifting to older ages. Young seniors, 65 to 74, will grow at a modest rate, but look at the growth in the 75 and over, and particularly 85 and over population, going to more than double during this time. So what does this mean? Well, one of the implications is that the seniors population as a whole is counting for a bigger and bigger share of total expenditures in the country. It's a well-off population, many of them still in good health, wanting to spend leisure time in various ways, and it's an attractive target group. For many years, I felt seniors were neglected in terms of advertising, starting to see that turn around a little bit, but as I've said in recent past presentations, there's money on the table that we had from this group. A second, this time, challenge that the aging presents is the decline in the growth of our labor force. And I borrowed this chart from StatsCan that compares sort of entrance into the labor force, 15 to 24-year-olds, with people getting ready to exit, 55 to 64-year-olds. And you can see for many years in the past, there was a wide gap where we had many more entrants than exiters. But in 2011, that crossed over, and in the recent census, we have the largest gap we've ever seen between the young and the old, with many more people getting ready to leave the labor force than enter, and that is really responsible in large part for the labor shortages that we all hear about today. Not the only factor, but by far the main factor. And this is something we could have seen coming, should have seen coming for the last 10 years or so. Good news is that that's going to turn around a little bit in the next 5 to 10 years, and the entrants and the exiters are going to be getting into more of an equilibrium, stable growth. And the third challenge we face is with our oldest population, 85 and over. You can see in the census there were 860,000 or so people over the age of 85 in Canada, and you can see how those numbers are going to rapidly increase and in fact pick up speed in terms of the increase over the next number of decades. And clearly this presents challenges to governments, to businesses, to provide the services, the products to this older population, many of whom want to age in place, want to stay in the community, what kinds of residences will be available to them, what kinds of products to allow them to adapt, perhaps adapt their homes. Many of these seniors actually living on their own in the community, and certainly providing the long-term care that will inevitably hit in. I saw a study from the Alzheimer's Association which tracked the projection in terms of number of people with dementia in the country, now about 600, 700,000, showing that's going to triple as well, follow exactly this pattern over the next 30 years. So many, many challenges to our older population. Housing and family, households and families. The makeup of households really hasn't changed a whole lot. About 30% of our households are one-person households, many older population, younger people. Equal numbers, just about, of couples with children, without children, about a quarter of all households in each case. 9% or so of our households are lone parent families, and smaller numbers of other types of families. For example, non-families of 2 or more people, people sharing accommodation in large part because of the costs in some cases. And you can see it's actually that small group, the non-family 2+ person households, that grew the most rapidly over the last 5 years. One-person households also growing fairly rapidly, much of that related to aging. Multi-generation households, a result of the immigrant intake, sometimes multi-generation families living together, the smallest growth in couples with children. The other important aspect of the new census is that for the first time we get a picture of the gender makeup of our country. Canada is the first country to count the transgender and non-binary population in the census, and you can see the results overall, a little over 100,000, and you can see the makeup between transgender men, women, and the non-binary population. And this, of course, then gets translated, I don't know what I'm doing. It's translated into a diversity of our families. You can see a diversity of couples now, same gender men, same gender women, transgender couples, non-binary couples, and in all cases, to one extent or another, various levels of children being present. For example, the transgender couples, 37% of them have children. So much more diverse families that we need to give some attention to. Income. Income in the census is always measured for the year before the census is taken. It's a complete year. So in this case, it's 2020, which of course fell right smack in the middle of the pandemic. Very high quality data in the census because now it comes directly from tax records. People no longer report their income, but StatsCan can match the census answers to the tax records and get a very detailed and very accurate picture of income. And if we look at what's happened in the 2020 income data, you can see a big increase in income in 2020 over 2015, over a 10% increase. And I've just pulled out the year-over-year increase from survey data, and you can see that most of that increase actually happened in the pandemic year, 2019 to 2020. So the pandemic has had a big effect. As you know, many pandemic-related payments And in fact, 70%, somewhere around 70% of Canadians received some type of pandemic-related payment. Some of them were top-ups to, for example, the OAS program. Most seniors received $500. The Child Tax Credit program was topped up. And of course, some big programs to replace lost employment income. So virtually everyone benefited, and that had a big effect on the overall income levels. See, overall, something like a 13% increase in people's income levels as a result of the pandemic payments. So we need to be a little bit careful in interpreting the income data if in 2020, which is clearly an abnormal year. A little higher for women than for men, probably due to the top-up in the child tax credit, and not surprisingly, big increases for young people and for people at the bottom of the income scale. Those incomes were already low, and so when they were topped up, they resulted in fairly large increases. And we'll see a little bit later other impacts the pandemic income data has had. So what happened to that extra money that people got? Here, our national accounts data shows us on a quarter-over-quarter basis the big bump that occurred in 2020. At the same time, expenditures dropped. People couldn't shop, didn't want to shop, were careful, and the gap between expenditures and income really widened, and that represents savings of one type or another to Canadians. You see, it got up to a level of 27%. Previously, before the pandemic, there virtually were no savings, 1%, 2%. It got up, it's come back down, but still is a large, much higher than it was before the pandemic. The recent quarter, the second quarter of this year, the savings rate was 6%, still much higher than that 1 or 2% we've seen. And the question is, what are people doing with that money? Are they holding on to it? Are they going to pay down debt? An important question. Some people had forecast that expenditures would pick up as people made up. Picked up a little bit in the last couple of quarters, but still not to a large extent. Linguistic diversity, we're going to get a lot more on the cultural makeup of the country, an important part of the results of immigration in the next release in the end of October. But we can get a little bit of an insight because the language data has been released. So what does it show? We look at mother tongue, the language first learned and still understood by people. We can see about 55% of Canadians report English as their mother tongue, about 20% French, 22% other languages other than English or French, and a small sliver actually reporting multiple tongues. Children learning both languages from the get-go. And in fact, it's that multiple mother tongue group that grew very, very rapidly. And I think what we're seeing now is increasingly immigrants teaching their children from the get-go both their mother tongue and English or French, depending on where they live. Big increase in other mother tongues, directly a result of immigration, and very little increase in English or French mother tongue. The leading mother tongues in terms of the size pretty much hasn't changed. You still see Mandarin, Punjabi, Cantonese, Spanish, Arabic at the top. But if you look at the change, we start to see the change in the immigration patterns that we've seen. Where are the big changes in terms of mother tongue? It's in those languages spoken in India. We saw a third of our immigrants come from India. So if we look at Hindi, Punjabi, Gujarati, very, very large increases in that population. Spanish also increasing by nearly 30%. At the other extreme, some of the languages spoken by immigrants who came many years ago, Polish, German, starting to actually decline as that population gets older and dies off. In terms of what languages are spoken at home, the census is a very rich source. Probably we have the best data on language of any country in the world. And we not only measure mother tongue, but we measure a couple different measures of languages spoken at home. And if we look at what languages people are actually speaking at home, pretty much follows the same profile as mother tongue. About a quarter of Canadians actually are speaking a language other than English or French at home, but most of them are combining it with English or French, or in some cases with both. But there are about 7% of Canadians who are not speaking either English or French at home, and that represents 2.6 million Canadians. An important target group. If you're reaching out to this group, you may need to consider advertising, communicating with them in their mother tongue. Language always generates great interest in the province of Quebec, no more than during an election campaign. And the data came out right in the middle of the election campaign in Quebec, and you can see what's been happening to the French language in Quebec. Its measure as the predominant language used at home has in fact been on the decline for 2 decades. And so that certainly fueled a lot of the debate on language immigration and whatnot in Quebec. You can see English and other languages, much smaller, but they've been sort of holding their own in terms of numbers. And finally, the other topic related to language is the bilingualism in the country. About 18% of Canadians report being able to speak both English and French, and that's been pretty flat now for about 2 decades. But if you look underneath that, there are 2 different trends occurring. There's been an increase in bilingualism in Quebec, getting up to nearly half of Quebecers able to speak both English and French, while in the rest of Canada, there's been a slow decline in bilingualism. So overall, numbers have stayed the same. New Brunswick numbers have pretty much been the same for 2 decades. And the final topic, new data we just released, or that StatsCan released yesterday on the housing conditions in Canada. First of all, home ownership, don't think it probably comes as a surprise, is on the decline. People can't afford homes anymore, particularly young people. You can see how ownership had picked up for many years, peaked in 2011, and has been on the decline ever since. And if we look at that by age, we can see very substantial declines in homeownership among young people. Again, I don't think that should come as a surprise. The 25 to 34-year-olds and to 35 to 44-year-olds showing those fairly sharp declines. Not much change at the older age group. Condos, we talked about the downtown areas growing very rapidly. Condos overall becoming more popular, both high-rise and low-rise condos, representing about 15% of the total dwelling stock. But if you look at the dwellings recently constructed between 2016 and 2021, in the 3 big metropolitan areas, over half of all dwellings were in fact condo, many of them high-rise. Overall in the country, a third of all dwellings were condos. The census measures the conditions of our housing stock, and this just summarizes a number of measures. Adequacy of housing measured in terms of to what extent major repairs are needed. And you can see about 6% of housing are in need of major repairs, always higher for renters than for owners, and extremely high in our First Nations on reserve population, housing a major, major challenge to that population. A second measure is suitability of housing. That compares the makeup of the house, the number of rooms, the number of bedrooms, to the composition of the household. And you can see again, 5–6% of housing not being suitable, much higher for renters, and extremely high for the bound housing. And in terms of the affordability of housing, about 20% of Canadians fall into the category of housing not being affordable. That is, they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. It's often used as a guideline. Much higher, of course, for renters than for owners. But if we look at what's changed, a number of things. If we look at the costs of shelter costs, that includes not only rent, but utilities and other factors needed to run the house. A 10% increase in costs, which about matched the consumer price index, about matched inflation, but renters had a much harder time in that their costs increased by 18%, nearly double the level of inflation. If we look at what all this did to the affordable housing situation, actually went down. The rates of unaffordable housing went down. Why did that happen? Go back to the pandemic income data. Income data got a boost, so the relative relationship between shelter costs and income actually made things look better, very temporarily, probably. So one needs, again, to be very careful in interpreting that data. So that's just to summarize the opportunities and challenges. Many newcomers coming into Canada, important new target groups. In fact, immigrants and their children account for virtually all of the growth that we're seeing in the country. Growth in the downtown of our large cities, an important target group. The spreading out of growth now into smaller urban and even the rural areas around the fringes of our CMAs. Our growing older population accounting for an increasing share of all expenditures, an important target group, and also the oldest seniors presenting us with many challenges in terms of how they want to and will be able to live out their older years. Finally, there's the language use, the need to perhaps communicate with some populations in their mother tongue. And finally, if any of the rhetoric we hear about new homes, new housing development that governments are offering up, any of that comes to fruition, there'll be a pent-up demand from young people to buy housing, and that may, in fact, hopefully pick up. What's ahead? I mentioned 2 more releases from StatsCan. Late October, we'll see data on immigration, citizenship, religion, and also mobility, and then a final big release on education, the labor force, a little bit of data, new data on a language. In terms of our own products, we have released Demostats 2022, unfortunately still based on the pre-census data. It gets developed before we see any of the census data, but we started to release the new census data in our Census Plus product, first as a flat file. Next year we'll continue to complete that release and also convert it into Envision. We'll shift for next year's Demostats to the new census geography, 6 new census metropolitan areas, and we'll be able to incorporate many, maybe not all of the trends we see coming out of the census. The one hang-up we have in terms of making the transition is that we need to get the measures of undercount in the census, which may be very different this time because of the pandemic, so we can make appropriate adjustments to the raw census data. And we'll be able to do that in 2024 when we'll complete our transition to the new base. Also start to look at review PRISM. Do we need to update it? Do we need to change some things everywhere? So with that, hopefully giving you a very quick overview of some of the opportunities and challenges the shifts in our population take. And maybe a little bit of time for questions if anybody has them. Let's see any questions.
Yeah, hi, I'm Weber from CIBC. In the beginning, you touched on an important point that along with a large number of immigrants, there are also an even larger number of temporary residents in the form of students or foreign workers. My question is that of late, we are seeing that the proportion of newcomers that is coming from this pool of temporary residents is becoming larger, perhaps disproportionately large. Do you think we would be able to have the data available in terms of how many people are making this transition? Can we identify that with a reasonable amount of accuracy? Because for somebody who's just coming new and somebody who's transitioning from the pool of temporary residents to permanent residents, their needs and their characteristics might be a little different.
Well, certainly the need, if I understand the question correctly, has to do with the accuracy of the data that with the accuracy of the data that we have on temporary and permanent residents. And the data we have, and it's in our new to Canada product, comes directly from the Immigration Department as they process. There are some issues, and we're looking at perhaps making some changes to that. One of the changes we want to make is to try and break out the incoming, both temporary and permanent, to those who are actually new to Canada. That is, they haven't been in Canada before, versus those who have been in Canada before. And we're working on that breakout for a future enhancement.